Excellent. I think I've remembered every week to record. It's a new world record. So, welcome to everyone once again. We're glad you're here. I do want to, because this is a shorter chapter, I also just want to review briefly where we've been, because I think this will help set us up to where we're headed. Each time we've reviewed our basic principles as a Lutheran church versus whatever denomination that we've been talking about. The first week, we reviewed Roman Catholicism, which I think many people have some idea about what that is. That is a week that I was in Japan, so I was not here, but you spent some time at Pastor Tim talking about the tradition of the Roman Catholic Church and how important that tradition is to them. I would say, to contrast with the Lutheran Church, we have found the Bible and the Word of God takes precedence over tradition. Tradition's important. Somebody thought about these things before us. We ought to think about it. But when it comes down to it, Jesus Christ centers and forms who we are, not the tradition of the church. Because sometimes the tradition has not been accurate. Sometimes the tradition has taken, forks in the road that weren't particularly Christian, and got involved with the business of the church and things. So, and when we can correct that, and of course, I think many of you remember that when speaking about the church, Luther often referred to the church as needing to be semper reforma, always reforming in the Latin. So, because of that, while we appreciate tradition, and certainly we have traditions in our church, we are always looking to improve upon those to make sure that we find Christ in the midst of those traditions. Okay, so first off, we look at the Roman Catholic Church. Then the next church we took up was almost an exact opposite, but it was one of our brothers and sisters in the faith from early on, the Moravian Church. And they were formed again in this little area, sort of southern Germany into Austria, that area of the world, Czechoslovakia, down in that corner of the world. And they started about 100 years before Martin Luther, but John Huss did not have the protection that Martin Luther had. So he was basically burned at the stake. The movement flailed for a while, but then came back around the time of Luther and still has churches today. So that was the Moravian Church. Last week, we looked at the Episcopalian Church. And this, of course, was looking at a lot of the history of the English monarchs with Henry VIII, why he decided to get a divorce, all his wives, and it's a very confusing sort of melodrama that happened there with the English church. But that was a Reformation, as we talked about last week. It was more from the top down. The word Episcopal in Greek means bishop. And so that was a Reformation that happened from the bishops in Henry VIII and was spread down to the people. Luther's Reformation did not come from the leaders, quote, of the church. It wasn't from the bishops and the Pope, but came from the laity and the pastors up. So those were some differences in how those Reformations, although I would say Episcopalians and Lutherans are very close in what we believe. I may have mentioned on this podcast or when I was in the teaching on Wednesday that if I couldn't find a Lutheran church, my next choice would probably be the Episcopalian Church. So it's very close to what we believe. And we welcome Ken and Susan there. I see them down on the side. They can see us. Good. Excellent. All right. Any questions just about where we've been and the landscape we have been on? And so far, we're talking the first three churches that we dealt with all emerged out of Europe. All right. The Roman Catholic Church, obviously out of Rome, hence the name Roman Catholic. And of course, they traced their roots back to Jesus like we all did, but it was an Italian centered church. Then we have the Moravian Church, which was Germany. Then we had the Episcopalian Church out of England. All right. But now we're moving to a uniquely American church when we look at the African American tradition with churches. Okay. So any questions from those first 3 weeks? Comments? Rebuttals? Heretical insights? Nothing? All right. Well, let's move then to the African American Methodist tradition. All right. whenever we see the word Methodist, and we're going to be looking at the Methodists next week and their movement, we're talking about a church that emerged out of the English Reformation, primarily through the influence of people like the Wesleys, both John Wesley and Charles Wesley, and also John Knox, who was Presbyterian but had some influence, and also John Calvin. So this is a wing of a Reformation that, as they make their way to America, will be quite different than the sort of churches that emerged in Central Europe. All right. And they made their way to America. All right. So it's going to be different because of that. The other thing we have to acknowledge right off the bat is that one of the reasons there is an African American church is because of slavery. In many ways, Black people felt that the church had justified slavery through the Bible. I think many Black people would say that they did not have a home in the white man's church. And so they began to develop their own churches where they were free to do so. So if you will notice, the African American churches that we're looking today, and they have Richard Allen there, emerged out of the Northeast. Why? Well, because they could. They could not necessarily, they could meet separately in camp meetings and things like that in the South, but they certainly weren't allowed to have churches. Now, of course, at some point, all of this spread to the South where they began to pick up members, et cetera, et cetera. But most of it began in what I would call the free North because of slavery. And I think that as Christians, we need to acknowledge there was sort of a white-Black problem. In fact, many people have still said today, the most segregated hour in America happens on Sunday morning, when we have the white churches and we have the Black churches. Now, along that line, one thing just to think about is it okay? So let's see what you think about this. Is it okay that the Black people have their own church? And maybe they don't want to come to white church. Maybe they would prefer to stay in their tradition, have Black church, make the rules they want, preach the things they want, say the things they want, do the things they want. What do you think about that? Is that okay? Is it not okay? Should they be converting us to join their churches? What do you think? Comments?
It's definitely okay.
Yeah.
Definitely. It's just a matter of what your style of worship is. And if you are spirit filled and you feel the Spirit and you want to move to the music and really get into the sensual part of worship, you might want to go to one of those churches.
Now, what if we were, so let me put it to you this way, Sharon, and I'm just trying to play devil's advocate here. So these aren't necessarily things I think, but I just want to push a little bit. So if the Black churches can have a Black church and do their thing, can we also have a white church that we say is for white people? Is that okay? Or is that not okay?
I think it is.
I'm sorry, what? I didn't hear you. Say again, Sharon.
I think it is, but does anyone here disagree?
Should it, I guess what I'm grabbing at though, should it be exclusively white? Like, can we say we're going to have a white church with no Black people?
Oh,
that
no.
probably would.
Yeah. No.
Linda?
I was just going to say, I think that if I would think I would be welcome at a Black church or a predominant Black church, and I would certainly welcome Black people at our church. We have some, I think. I know one man. So, but I think that it should be open to wherever you feel comfortable, whatever suits you.
Mm-hmm.
Others?
Just the same as there's those mega churches, which I don't want to go to.
Right. Right. Yeah. Me neither. Right. Other.
I would say my thought is it's fine to have for Black people to have Black churches, but I guess there's a broader discussion around why that's necessary and why maybe there are more predominantly white churches, and what does that say about our culture as a whole that maybe we're still segregated in many ways.
Right. And I do think, I mean, the truth is, I think we need to think about that. And what are ways that, although our church is predominantly white, what are ways in which we are open to other ethnicities, whether it's Spanish or whether it's Black or whether it's Caribbean or whether it's whatever. I mean, while we may be white, how are we open to that? And by the way, just, I landed on the Lutheran Church last week when I talked about our history in Germany with the Nazis flag and our sanctuaries, et cetera, et cetera. But let me just say, with the white-black issue, the truth of the matter is that we were an immigrant church from Germany and from the Scandinavian countries. And when we settled in this country, we settled in places that were primarily done by immigrants in immigrant communities. So when we settled in upstate New York, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Minnesota, there were not Black people there because there were not jobs for Black people there. They were largely in the South and were slaveries. Our white ancestors who came here had white children. You with me on this?
Mm-hmm.
So when we settled in ethnic enclaves and the Danes settled together and the Swedes and the Norwegians and the Germans, they married other white people and they had white babies. It wasn't that they were anti-Black, it was just that that's where they were at the time. That is not as true for the churches that were born in America in the South, because they had Black neighbors and they did not integrate them. So Lutherans get a little bit of a pass there here, but as we have expanded now into Texas and the Southwest and stuff, I think the issue is becoming more before us, that how do we as a denomination, even though we were primarily an immigrant church, and there were not Black people primarily in the Scandinavian countries. All right. I'm not saying a Black person never went there, but I'm saying in general, the people who came from Scandinavian were white and they had white children. All right. That's just the way history was. But now that we're in larger communities that are more racially diverse, now how do we do that? And I think that's the challenge that's before us. We've tried to do some things as denominations, but I think Lutherans in general, at least for a while, can say our ethnic history has been very white. And until we get more or around more Black people and have churches in those areas, that'll be the case for a generation or so yet. But at some point, hopefully that'll change. And by the way, if we weren't white, we'd find another way to discriminate against one another. I used to have this dream when I was little that one day we would all take a magic pill and we would all end up the same color and no one would know the difference. But you know what then? We discriminate on basis of your earlobes or whether you have brown hair, or gray hair, or your income. We find another way. Exactly. So at any rate, the churches that then emerged in the African American community largely started in the North. One of those churches was founded by Richard Allen, who's pictured on page 7 there in the front, as walking down the steps. He founded the AME Church. In particular, that church is Mother Bethel, which is on the south side of Philadelphia. And I did my seminary work in Philadelphia. And so I had a chance to visit Mother Bethel and be part of their congregation. They are very welcoming of white people. But the one thing I would say, just in what their tradition is church starts, like, say, at 10 o'clock. It goes till about 3 in the afternoon. But people aren't sitting there that whole time. They're sort of in and out, and some come late, some come early, some will get up and get a cup of coffee. It's more sort of like they're having a meeting and people are in and out of it, is more what it's like. Very rarely is there anyone sitting there for the whole time. Usually about an hour and a half into it, the pastor will get up and give a sermon, which is largely a Bible study, not so much a sermon. Like when I think about a sermon, you've crafted certain words you're going to say, as opposed to let's look at the 10th chapter of the Gospel of John and talk about it, and people get out your Bibles. It's more of a Bible study sort of thing. But of course, you can have homiletical moments in it as part of the sermon. And of course, they pass the offering. And like the Catholic churches, what I noticed is often they will pass the offering several times. So they'll pass the offering, the counters go back and count it, and the pastor will say, "Hey, there's not enough here. We're going to start a new food ministry this week, and we need a lot more than that. So let's pass the hat again." And but the one thing I will say about that is that if you think about it, if you know there's going to be 3 or 4 or 5 offerings, you're holding back a little bit. Like you're not giving, you're not giving your main offering first because you know they're going to be passing the hat again. And that's the same in the Catholic Church that all said, well, now we're collecting for the bishop's fund. Well, you know it's coming. So you haven't given the whole 9 yards up front. You've saved some back. But it was a wonderful experience. I've been there several times since. They're very welcoming of all visitors. But it is a Black church, and they mean to be a Black church. And the other thing that I think it says in the book, which I think is also true, many of these churches are also truly neighborhood churches. And what I mean by that is the church is a community center. So it was a place where people came for meals. It's a place where people came after school to study. They had a gymnasium where kids would play basketball or volleyball. But the church, it's like a YMCA that also has a sanctuary. You know what I mean? And I mean that in the best possible way. It's just very different. This is in the south side of Philadelphia. If any of you have been down there, it's not the safest neighborhoods. When I did my my work down there at a church, my pastor who directed me said, "Do not ever come down here without your clerical collar on, because it's protected." Right.
Yeah.
So make sure you have your
founded.
Yeah, let's make sure you have your clerical collar on so that you're safe. Okay. So it's a rough neighborhood. The doors of the church there were always open. And it was really a community center for them. So that's one thing I will say about these churches. Let's look back on page 9 and let's look at these differences or similarities also. Oh, one thing I wanted to do is I'm not going to sing it because it's hard to sing in the Zoom setting here, but I just want to read you one of the African American spirituals that would be used in these churches and other churches that I'm sure you know because we use it in our hymnal. And I just want you to hear the words and how much this tradition values the simplicity. And what I mean by that is the simplicity of what's important. Okay, so I'm just going to read the verses of this hymn. It repeats a lot, so I'm not going to do all the repeats, but I just want you to hear the words, and then afterwards ask you, what did you hear in this hymn? Okay, so it's the hymn that sometimes we use during Holy Week. We might use it other times too, but it's from the African American spiritual tradition, and the hymn is "Give Me Jesus." Okay, so let me just read the words. They're very simple. In the morning when I rise, give me Jesus. Give me Jesus. You may have all the rest. Give me Jesus. Verse 2. Dark midnight was my cry. Give me Jesus. Verse 3. Just about the break of day. Give me Jesus. Verse 4. Oh, and when I come to die, give me Jesus. Verse 5. When I want to sing, give me Jesus. And then the refrain for all the verses. Give me Jesus. Give me Jesus. You may have all the rest. Give me Jesus. So are you familiar with that hymn? Yes? Okay.
Yeah, I
So
know.
but we sing it here. Yeah, okay. Do you hear, what do you hear when you hear that hymn? Do you hear the simplicity in it? It's not complicated. It's not like reading through the Augsburg Confession to Emperor Charles V, which was done in both German and Latin. There's just a simplicity to it. And I love the refrain where you can have all the rest. You can have all the rest. Give me Jesus.
And that's what stands.
Very simple.
Give me Jesus stands out more than anything. It keeps repeating.
Yep. You can have the rest. Give me Jesus. There was a professor down here at Trinity Seminary. His name was Rudolph Featherstone. I don't know if any of you ever knew Rudolph or not, but he taught down here at Trinity Seminary. I didn't go there, but I knew of him. And he was a professor. He was a pastor. He had an earned PhD. Da 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 da. And he always used to say, when I write my obituary, here's what I wanted to say: Rudolph Featherstone, child of God, follower of Jesus. That's it. A simplicity, which I think sometimes can be helpful for the church. All right, let's take a look then at their teachings vis-a-vis the Lutheran teachings. If you look on page 9 in those boxes, they believe the Bible contains the Word of God. Okay, we accept the Bible as the written witness of God's revelation of saving action through Jesus Christ. I mean, very similar. Number 2, they teach justification by faith, same as we do. Number 3, consider baptism and Holy Communion not only symbolically, but as signs of God's grace. We consider baptism and Holy Communion as means of conveying God's grace. I mean, the first 3 are really very similar, okay? On number 4, I'll go to the Lutheran side first. We believe the church lives to preach the gospel and celebrate the sacraments, giving strength for service in the world. This comes from the Augsburg Confession, where there's a line that says, Satest est. It's Latin for it is enough. It is enough that the gospel be preached and the sacraments be administered to be a church. This is one place we differ, and I think it's an important difference, but I also think it's an interesting difference. They believe the church, to be the church, has to be actively involved in the affairs of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
Yeah.
So they believe it's very important that the neighborhood they're in is the neighborhood they serve. One of the problems sometimes with some of our big downtown Lutheran churches in America is that the white people have moved out. And some of those churches, not all of them, but some of them have refused to serve the surrounding community. And so while the church will be maintained downtown and people will drive in on the Sunday morning to go to church, they never interact with the local community. And what happens to those churches?
Mm-hmm.
They die, right? They no longer are in existence or very slight existence. In our community, First English Lutheran Church, which is in the heart of sort of, I would put it near the Children's Hospital, Old Town East, that section of Columbus, has really tried to integrate the community as best they can. But it's hard. I mean, it's a hard row to hoe down there, and they're trying to do the best they can, but it's difficult because of all the urban problems. These churches had big, massive buildings, which became muddy pits. I had said years ago that probably what they should have done was kept the land for First English and demolished the church and rebuilt something along the lines of a community center. It would have been much easier to keep up. And, when you've got church with a massive steeple and these old roofs and everything else, I mean, it costs a lot of money to maintain those. And so that's part of the trouble they're running into down there as well. Just keeping it up is a difficulty. So at any rate, those churches believe in being involved in the community. Now, the good side of that is they're involved in the community, right? The bad side of that is sometimes they can be a lot involved in political things. So it's not uncommon for these kinds of churches to have political candidates in their congregation. Mother Bethel has on many occasions, which sometimes I'm a little, what are we doing here? We're sort of mixing religion and government at that point. But because they believe in the community, they will have community activists, they will have politicians come to their pulpit and speak to their people. Thoughts? Do you have any thoughts on that? Anybody? Okay, then I'm having my candidates at our church on Sunday. Is that all right with everybody? Everybody good with that? No? No?
Delaware
funny when we-
Delaware has an AM, Zion AME, a church that was founded in the late 1800s. And I've often wanted to go, but on Sunday, well, I have to go to my church too. But when I used to go to Gulf Shores in the winter, one of my Catholic friends loved to go over to Pensacola to the Black Mass in the big, huge Catholic church, and they were so welcoming, and
Yeah.
it was the 2 or 3 hour kind of thing, and very informal, and everybody is wonderful, and you come out and you're just so happy. And I was reading about our Zion AME here, and it fits the profile completely. They in Delaware, many people of color have a section of the south end of the town, and they have a center, and they have lots of things going on, but they participate also in citywide affairs, and their pastor will often be there, and if prayer is appropriate, he'll be the one who does the prayer. So there's a tacit difference after young children get out of school. I've been told that the mingling in grade school, middle school, high school is excellent, but then white goes its way, black goes its way. So it's gonna take a long time to meld.
Yeah.
But I'm proud that they were part of, well, Ohio was so much in the Underground Railroad, and Delaware was part of that too. Yeah.
And all these things, I mean, unfortunately, it tips both ways. I mean, it's great they're involved in the community, but how do you keep that line clear between church and state? I mean, it becomes a little bit of a fuzzy thing sometimes. So it's like, how do you do this? I mean, it's hard, very hard. Sharon, you were going to say, or no?
No.
Okay. But because they have that characteristic of being involved in the community, I think that part of that comes from this idea that what they're doing is in church is empowering them for the world. And what I mean by that is that they may have not a very good job and not make very much money, but when they come to church, it's truly a sanctuary in which they are valued. So, and they may have, and I'm saying, over time, they may have had incidents where racist remarks are being shouted at them, horrible things were being done to them. But when they were in church, they were taught that they were valued and they were somebody. And I think that church for these people has become that place where they're valued. And I hope we've now extended that to the whole community, that Black people and white people feel valued at church and at school and in the polling place and in the public square and in the stadium, wherever they go. I hope we've done that. But I think there certainly was a time in our history when Black people did not feel valued outside of the church. When they would go to a restroom and there was a separate restroom, if any, for colored people, or a separate drinking fountain, they weren't valued or allowed to vote in many states right up through the 1980s, by the way. This is not a new thing. It's not something that occurred 60 years ago. There was voter suppression of Black people right through the 1980s in a lot of places. So this is not ancient history for some of these people. And of course, what happened in the 60s was not ancient history, right? I mean, I think there was even a Black Baptist church that was bombed in Birmingham. Was it Birmingham? Somebody help me remember where the 3 girls were in Sunday school class. Yeah. So this is an ancient history. And that's why I think for many Black people, the church becomes still that sanctuary. And of course, you may remember that there was a Lutheran church in the South. I'm sorry, there was a Black church in the South where a Lutheran came in and shot them all at Bible study not too many years ago. And again, I think that's never too far from the mind of many people in the African American community of what can be done and has been done. And it's
And
a
that
sad
was in
state of affairs.
Charleston. And wasn't he
Yes,
a
exactly.
Lutheran?
He was
Well,
Lutheran.
Yeah,
Now, I'm not saying I would argue he wasn't probably doing it in the name of the Lutheran Church. At least I hope he wasn't. I think he was just a crazy
yeah,
person.
just, yeah.
But unfortunately, they welcomed him into that Bible study, and then he turned around and shot them all. It's
Yeah.
just and what do you think that was? Maybe 10 years ago, something? Not a
Oh,
long time,
not
not
long.
that far.
I
Yeah,
think- I don't know.
8 or 10 years ago. Yeah. At any rate,
Want me
so
to
they're
check?
aware of those things. Okay. I just know it's been in our recent memory at least. Okay. All right. Let's look then at as we go down the list there, and Mary, like CNN, is going to fact check me here to see what if I'm in the vicinity. So, but if you look down on their type of worship, you'll notice that while we follow the Western rite, right, and we talked about that in other times, we gather, we read God's word, we have a meal, and then we're sent out to serve. That's the Western church. Their churches are quite free and emotional. We mentioned spiritual here earlier, but it's not based on a liturgical pattern. And you can also, to be honest about it, you can see how that constraints of the liturgy may have been like a straitjacket for Black churches. For the white people to come and say, this is how you will worship. I'm sure it made some of them to think, we'll do what we want, thank you very much. And the sort of free form that they have, and you come in and out, if you arrive an hour late, it's no big deal. Leave an hour early, it doesn't matter. All of that is part of, I think, a history in which they felt shackled or straitjacketed by white people. And so in their liturgy, it becomes time just to express themselves however they want. At the same time, having visited many of these churches before, there is a sort of liturgy to it. There's a certain things that happen at certain times, and you can tell what's happening. Did you find it out, Mary?
Yes, it was in 2015.
Okay, so 9 years ago. Yeah.
That was almost
And
spot on. I'm sorry.
And it was in Charleston, South Carolina?
Yeah, Charleston,
Or where?
South Carolina. It says a white supremacist gunman entered the church during Bible study, opened fire, and he killed 9, including the senior pastor. Be careful.
Well, you'll notice that our pulpit's made of metal, so I can duck behind it if need be. That was intentional. It's got
Good
Kelvin,
luck.
so yes, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but that was
Well,
terrible.
but within the last decade, there's been major, and also I think it hasn't been in the press here in the North. There's been many black churches burned in the South in the last decade as well.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, we're not far enough away from that. Hopefully one day we can call all of that ancient history, but it is still going on in some ways.
Yeah, I
Okay.
wish. I pray.
Go ahead.
I just
So
said I wish
governance. Yes, I pray too. If you look under governance, they're Episcopal. Again, the word Episcopal in Greek means bishop, right? Episcope, bishop. But there's no claim to apostolic succession. We talked about this last week. Whereas the English church and the Roman church claim apostolic succession all the way back to Peter, this church does not claim that. We also do not claim apostolic succession. All right. Apostolic succession means that Peter was the first pope who was blessed by Jesus to be the first pope. Then Peter blessed somebody else to be the second pope, all the way down till today, till Pope Francis, somebody from this line laid their hands on his head. I think it's a lot of hoo-ha myself, but it's a way of sort of saying there was a tradition before us. That's fine. But the historicity of it is lacking at best. But they've manufactured some fiction to make it sound like it's going to happen. The other thing, frankly, does it really matter? If we believe the Holy Spirit is among us today, I mean, I don't need to have my hand blessed all the way back. Do you see what I mean? If you break that chain, does that keep God out of our lives? I don't think so. So at any rate, but they don't claim that either. Okay. Congregation is quite free within defined parameters. Okay. They're free to do a lot of things. We are more interdependent. We have constitutions and things like that in ours. All right. Let's open it up. That's sort of some of the comparisons, but go ahead. Let's go to some questions and comments. Go ahead, Sharon.
Yes, I'm wondering what their seminary status is. Are there seminaries? Are there Black seminaries, or do they integrate with?
There are Black seminaries, but most of these denominations don't have their own denominational seminaries. They will tend to take courses from either colleges or our seminaries or Roman Catholic seminaries. So I don't know of any AME seminary in the country. Now, I'm not saying there isn't one, so maybe someone can fact check to see if there is, but I know of none. In general, pastors are risen up within the congregation. And so there would be a young man who they believe has a future as a pastor, and then they would raise that person up, support that person through college, support that person through sometimes a type of training. But normally, a lot of the training takes place on site, right, with the other bishops and elders who are at that congregation. Are you with me? That's different from our church. We identify people who we think should go into the ministry. We send them off to college and seminary, and then they serve someplace else. Normally, they do not serve in their local church, all right, because we want the relationship to be pastor and congregation, not in-house. But other churches do other things. So many of the AME pastors that I know have very little official training, but a lot of counseling and support by the elders of their congregation. Does that make sense? You understand what I'm saying?
Martin Luther King Jr., though, didn't he have a college and maybe seminary?
I think maybe he went to Harvard Seminary. I thought I heard someone say one time. I don't quote me on that, but yes. And it's different for each tradition. I mean, some people, the other thing, like anything, people may go off and get a PhD in something and then feel the call to ministry. You know what I mean? So it happens across a broad spectrum. Right, exactly. Jean Wood.
Yeah, I have met ministers who are, have come up from their congregations who have PhDs like in psychology or sociology or whatever, So, they could, it seems to be as long as they're educated, it doesn't matter. And when it comes to, who's ordained, that's always been unclear to me as how they achieve the ordination.
Well, it's done within the congregation. So in our orders, the synod and the bishop would ordain people. Because their leaders are bishops, they can ordain within the congregation. So the senior pastor there, if you look at like Mother Bethel, he is a bishop. The church, that church, decided he was bishop and consecrated him as bishop. Then he can ordain other pastors to bring them up within that congregation. I mean, often, even when they're off at school, they could be going to seminary, but they would also be serving at that congregation at the same time, is what often happens. So they identify somebody they think would be a good fit for their congregation. By the way, this has often been sometimes the son of the previous pastor. That's the way this has gone in a lot of these churches. And someone would say, well, but if they grew up in the home of the pastor, they understand what it is, but often they can be sort of, what do I want to say, singled out and encouraged to go into ministry, but they would work in that church and also go to seminary, but also be preaching and stuff in the church at the same time while they're getting their education. Ours is a separate process. You go off to school, you go off to seminary, and then you're ordained by the church, and then you look around for a call. Well, you look around for a call and you're ordained, but it's a different process.
One more question. How have they accepted women as easily and quickly as Lutherans have done?
No.
Pastors.
No. Right. It depends on the denomination. Certainly the Methodist Church that we're going to be looking at next week has, but as far as I know, the AME Church is still ordaining only male pastors. They have deacons and they have women to do our thing. Part of this is also an issue for the Black community that tends to be run by the men, not the women. And that's true in the African American churches that I know of. It's not that they don't have people, sometimes they call them prophets, who will preach and teach, who are women, but the male leadership is pretty dominant in the Black churches still to this day. That varies. I mean, I'm not saying that's across the board the way it has to be, but most of these churches, it is still male dominated. And I would say that's unfortunate. But at this point, that's the way some of these churches, it seems like later emerging churches take longer to include women. Isn't that, I mean, you think about the church growth that we've had in Africa, largely male. Women are not really seen as leaders yet, even though who leads the world? Come on. Yeah, the women are doing a lot of the leadership behind the scenes, I'm afraid. But in a lot of these emerging churches, it tends to be more conservative with male leadership. And one day we hope that female leaders will come along and be recognized, but not yet. Look at the Islamic faith. They do not have male leaders, do they? I mean, female leaders to this day. It's later, it's about 500 years later than Christianity, but some of these, it takes time, unfortunately, for people to recognize the truth that God made male and female and we're equal and both can serve. I don't have any problem with that. Certainly was true in the New Testament church that women served. I mean, sometimes I want to say to these Bible thumpers, have you read the Bible? I think women are pretty prominent there. Who were the first witnesses of the resurrection? It wasn't the men. They were off hiding somewhere. It was the women, right? They're the ones at the tomb. They're the ones who first saw Jesus, not the men. The men were chicken. Imagine that, huh? Yeah. So one day I hope that we will see all churches, all faiths have both women and men. But the Catholics don't, right? They don't allow women to be ordained. And here's one for you to think about. I know you've covered the Catholics, but think about this. I guarantee you that they're going to allow priests to marry openly before they allow women to be ordained in the Catholic Church. You want to take a little bet on that? And I'll bet that could happen in my lifetime. It's already happening to a certain extent.
That would have to
So
come
for instance,
for women serving.
what's that?
The priest marrying would have to come before women became priests.
Right. And by the way that it works right now, I'm a Lutheran pastor. If I would convert to Catholicism, I could be an ordained priest in the Catholic faith and be married to my wife. Now, if my wife dies, I can't remarry. But I know other Lutheran ministers who have become Catholic priests and are married, right? So that's the first step in allowing this. And they will eventually allow celibacy. You know the old joke. All the priests are down there copying over the Bible. And they're running in there, writing it down. All of a sudden, the one priest says, "Oh my God, what?" He says, "It's not celibate, it's celebrate." What have we been telling people for years?
Love it.
At any rate, I think they are more likely to have priests married because there's not enough priests.
Yeah.
I've I've been in Dublin now 33 years. We have had one Roman Catholic church. And in that same amount of time, we've probably grown 20 Protestant churches, right? You only have one Catholic church in Dublin, St. Bridget's. That's it. They don't have enough. I mean, that church is overwhelmed. You know, they need 3 or 4 Catholic churches up here. You know, Dublin has grown from 10,000 to 40,000 to what now? 90,000 people or whatever it is. I mean, and they've had one church that whole time. It's not enough for the amount of Catholics in the area. But
well, Saint Bernard Brendan has taken in a lot of Dublin, even though they are in the north end of Hilliard.
right.
Yeah.
And St. Peter's over here and others, St. Anne's, what's across the river here. But it's still not enough. I mean, they need more churches. They don't have the priests for them. So, to which I would say, boo-hoo, how about you start dating women? There's an idea. Position for thyself, at any rate. Other questions about the African American Methodist churches? One of the things that just to throw out there is you'll notice there's not African American Lutheran churches. I know of none. And again, it's partly where our people landed and immigrated to and things like that, but that hasn't been a very good mix. Lutherans in general have not welcomed very many people of color into its midst. It's still true today. If you look at our church, I can see it from the pulpit. I'd say we're what, 96, 97% white. I mean, my wife's Asian, I guess, although she's half white, half Asian. We have 1 or 2 black people, but pretty white, don't you think?
Would I be racist if I said that white Lutherans are so buttoned up and we are so afraid to express our emotions in church, and blacks are just the opposite. They are so emotional.
Well, and maybe because that's been a place where they can be emotional. You know what I mean? Like they weren't allowed to show their emotions when they're out on the street because the police would lock them up or the slave master would whip them, right? So they could show their emotions in church. Whereas Lutherans were taught, you show your emotions at home. Don't dare do that here. So,
and I'm sure that many of them see in Jesus the trial that their ancestors have been and they feel he's a brother to them.
Well, I mean, often our theology is reflected in our own history. So if you have been spit on,
persecuted,
you've been persecuted, crucified, you may have a certain affinity with Christ. Pete?
Yeah, I remember some years back, the choir sang some bouncy, upbeat song. I don't remember what it was offhand, but it was a real energetic piece. And it came to an end, and some little kid in the back of the church yelled, "Yay!" It came as such as a surprise because we don't do that.
And by the way, I mean, it's not like one is bad and one is good. It's just different.
No.
I mean, the African American tradition built its whole preaching around call and response. When I'm preaching up there, if I were preaching in a Baptist church, I'd say something and somebody'd say, "Come on now," or "Amen." And there's this call and response. That's not the way we preach. It's not. It doesn't mean that our way is awful and their way is perfect. It's just different. You know, I mean, like some people like rock music, some people like classical. I mean, it's different. And what I think is each tradition should play to its strengths. I mean, let's do what we do best, which is chorales and organ music and symphonic instruments. And I mean, we can do that really well. And other churches do some of the praise music. Some of them do a lot of spirituals. I mean, I think it's great, but I just think people are different. And I think the differences are okay. And you should try to be who you are and not try to be somebody else. mean, I have to see sometimes when I've gone to concerts and I've seen white choirs up there trying to sing like black people. It's sort of like, what are we doing here? And there's a little cultural appropriation there too that can happen. Mary?
You know that one of the choral directors at St. Olaf in Minnesota is Black. Anton.
No,
Anderson,
Anton Armstrong.
Yeah.
Anton Armstrong.
Yeah, Armstrong. And he was invited to come to Sandusky, Ohio. They have an arts foundation that they will bring somebody to town to do their thing. And so he came to direct the Mozart Requiem. And we have family in Sandusky, and we went up every Wednesday night to go to practice. And he wasn't there. One of the high school directors led our practices. And then he came the week or two before. And he had a varied program. After we did the Requiem, then we did some gospel singing. And he just, at one point, he threw up his hands. He said, "You white people just can't sing our music." And we all just laughed and we said, "You're right."
Well, Anton Armstrong is classically trained, and he is not part of the black community. You know what I mean? He's been classically trained, and he's
yes. He's fabulous to sing for. It was quite a joy. In fact, I'm going to ask Jeremy when he starts to rehearse the Mozart Requiem. I'm going to ask him if I may rejoin the choir just to do that, because I have sung now for 4 different directors on the Mozart Requiem, and I'd like to make it a handful.
Yeah, I'm sure he would be happy to have you.
Yeah, I know that because the choir's going to sing that in Prague, and so I'm going to be in Prague with the choir this time, and so I'm going to sing for the Mozart Requiem too. So I'm sure he's allowing me. So,
well, if he allows you, he has to allow me.
And he's got to allow Mary too. Exactly. So we shall see.
It's a wonderful piece of stuff.
It's a wonderful piece of music. Yes, I've sung it many times. It's awesome. Well, I have church council tonight. My favorite week of the Tuesday of the month. Can you see that smile? At any rate, so I've got to get ready for that. But next week, we are going to look at Methodism, and it's rising out of England and then coming to America, and John Wesley and that crew. So we'll take a look at that, and we'll be back at 6 o'clock next Tuesday. All right?
Yep.
All right. Blessings to everyone. Hi, Heidi. Bye. Hi, Susan. Hi, Ken. Bye-bye.